So tonight I watched another documentary on basically old Hollywood. It was one that I don't know if it ever actually got a release in America. I know that it's Australian, so it was released in Australia last year, and it played a couple of festivals in America, but I don't think it ever had a theatrical release. And then it went on VOD, and now it's on Netflix, and so I, being the lazy person that I was, didn't get around to watching it when it was on VOD, and then it popped on Netflix, and so that saved me $3. But if you don't have Netflix, it's worth $3. It's directed by Gillian Armstrong, who, as you probably know, did my favorite movie of all time, Little Women. And this film is called The Women He's Undressed, and it's about Orry-Kelly, who was a costume designer in old Hollywood, mostly at Warner Brothers, after the war, various other places. The documentary really goes into that and why he left, how he got to Warner Brothers, why he left Warner Brothers, etc., etc. He won 3 Oscars until Catherine Martin won her second batch of Oscars for her Baz Luhrmann films. He was the most award-winning Academy Award-winning Australian. If you read some of how Gillian Armstrong got to doing this documentary, she didn't really know much about him or about old Hollywood because she's from Australia. And in doing research on Orry-Kelly, she discovered that he had actually written memoirs that were with his great niece. So the original film conception came before they'd found the memoirs, and I'm not sure now how much of the memoirs were used, but it seems like quite a bit of the memoirs ended up being used in this documentary. And I really want to read the memoirs because they're very juicy, and they have a lot to say about a certain Mr. Cary Grant whose sexuality is often debated and hotly denied by a lot of people. And there's just so much proof that I don't understand why you can't just, accept that perhaps, if not gay, he was bisexual and that he was unhappy because he was in a time where it was hard to be out and that unhappy, and so you were not out and you were unhappy. But that's neither here nor there. The documentary traces Orry-Kelly from a child in Australia through vaudeville and Broadway in New York, through Hollywood, through his death at the age of 60-something from liver cancer from drinking too much. And they show how he pretty much lived a pretty out life, partly because when he came to New York, it was the 20s, it was the jazz age. He lived in Greenwich Village, where pretty much all the things that became taboo in the 30s and to today are still slowly being less and less taboo, were perfectly okay. And then he got to Hollywood where, there was out and there was out, And so there were, people you knew were gay, like him and the various other costume designers, Adrian, etc., and the rumored ones, Cary Grant, Randolph Scott, etc. And then there's this heartbreaking story about Billy Haynes that I guess I had not heard before. I knew he was gay, but I didn't know that he basically gave up his career to stay with his husband. And then, well, it's common law husband because, the Constitution is terrible. Well, no, the Constitution is okay. We didn't say it was constitutional until last summer. And I was reading about him. This is not about the documentary, but I was reading about him, and apparently he died when he was in his 70s, and his partner committed suicide shortly after because he'd lived with him for 50 years, and he just couldn't handle it, and it made me really upset. But also it's kind of lovely because they dedicated their lives to each other so completely. But also horrible that Billy Haynes is a great actor, and that we only got a decade of him because Hollywood was such a moralistic, terrible place. Really frustrating. The Hays Code just ruined a lot of things. So speaking of the Hays Code, Orry-Kelly did a lot with his costumes early on to sort of egg on the Hays Code, and they talk about his use of costumes towards the end of the Hays Code with Some Like It Hot and Gypsy, that really pushed the boundaries of what was allowed. And like those Marilyn Monroe dresses, like how they got away with that, I will never know. But he won one of his Oscars for that, and and they talk about him working with Betty Davis and Kate Francis and several other of the Warner stars. It's really interesting. Now, where the documentary is super loopy is that on top of like interviews with modern costume designers and historians and things, and this is I guess where they're tapping into the memoirs, they like recreate scenes with him and with his mother and with Cary Grant and with Ginger Rogers and some other things, and it's a little weird. Especially at first, it's kind of jarring because it's very hyper, like a portrait studio kind of feeling. And then the more you just sort of go with it, basically. So I can see why maybe some people would be like, what am I watching? But I just found it really fascinating from start to finish, and makes me want to start my gay old Hollywood blog even more now. I have to do some more research, and then maybe I'll launch something. We'll see. I'll put a pin in it for now, but it's gonna happen. And also, I really need this book. I need to read his memoir. I need to know everything. So this was the Women He's Undressed from 2015 from Gillian Armstrong. It's about costume designer Orry-Kelly. If you like gay things, if you like old Hollywood, if you like Gillian Armstrong, if you like any of these things, Warner Brothers, Marilyn Monroe's boobs, Jane Fonda, Angela Lansbury, you name it, it's in this movie, and you should check it out.